In this video, I'm going to tell you about one thing. Just one thing. Because recently I've come across something very unusual. A medieval word, a nickname. Some have called it a title, others like me have called it a mess. Not only because it hasn't been used for centuries, not only because no one can remember what it means, but because we can't even translate it. This is the royal title that no one can remember. This is the untranslatable. But first, a word from me. Several, actually, because this is my video, and that's how it works. So, what is this thing? Well, the most basic answer is that it's a word in Welsh, Gwledig. And it's not some ancient forgotten word like you might expect with a topic like this. It's still used today, where it means rustic or rural, a combination of the Welsh word for country, gwled, and a suffix denoting an adjective. Basically, country-like. One problem, though. 600 years ago, this seems to have been applied to something else. Something that's quite different. A person. The mystery deepens. Because in medieval Wales, we can find 15 monarchs with this Gwledig as their epithet. An epithet was used essentially like a nickname, usually describing where the ruler was from or some sort of distinct trait. For example, tall, bold, greasy, bearded, or being from Gwynedd. The 4 traits that everyone must choose from at some point. So on the surface, they seem to be describing these rulers as country-like. However, this meaning only appears from 1604 onwards, first showing up in the dictionary of Sir Thomas Williams. Instead, for the previous 200 years, it seems to have been used to denote something else. Something much harder to translate. And unfortunately for us, no one seems to have remembered what it originally meant. 2. The 15 GWLEDIGION. So what we're left with then are these 15 GWLEDIGION, all sharing a status, all sharing an epithet, all of which have had this lost to time. To start, maybe it would be best if we took a look at what these royals had in common, in order to see what these medieval scribes, and later modern theorizers, had in mind when someone was Gwledig. These 15 men can be broadly divided into 2 categories. 3. The mythological fig. The first are the ones that occur within Welsh mythology. They're largely concentrated amongst only a few stories. In the tale of Branwen Fyrch Llŷr, we meet a man named Llŷr Gwledig, who is the father of various characters in the story. In the passage known as Brydwyd Rhonabwy, we can also find 3 characters. Gwir Gwledig, a chancellor to King Arthur Caswallawn Gwledig, the father of various characters in several different stories. Beli Mar Gwledig. The last of these doesn't have this epithet here, though. Instead, he gets it in our final story, Culhwch ac Olwen, where Caswallawn also reappears alongside 4 other individuals, Amlawd Gwledig and Custennin Gwledig, the grandfathers of our titular hero Cilyd Gwledig, the father of one of King Arthur's warriors, and Taran Gwledig, the father of the wicked king who is transformed into a boar and hunted by King Arthur. These 8 royals make up a little over half of our list. With all of these names being based in mythology, you might be surprised to learn that the other half of the list is made up of historical figures. 4. The historical figures. We can split these 7 men into 2 groups, extraordinary violence and other. Of the others, we have Caswallawn Gwledig, a name that appears once in a genealogy, and Pabio Gwledig, the father of a Welsh saint. Can you guess what the rest were known for? Caradocus Gwledig, a king in the north of Britain, is suggested by the historian Peter Bartram to be the Caradocus mentioned by St. Patrick, who chastised his violent actions towards fellow Christians. Cunedda Gwledig was the probably mythologized ancestor of the kingdom of Gwynedd in North Wales, the lead figure in a definitely real story where this kingdom just so happens to lay an ancestral claim to all of its neighbors by conquering half of the country and driving all of the Irish away. Cadel Gwledig was the king of Powys in eastern Wales, famed for attacking literally all of his neighbors. Emrys Gwledig was the Welsh translation of a man named Ambrosius Aurelianus, a son of Roman officials who supposedly helped the Britons fight off the Saxons for several years. And finally, we have Macsen Gwledig, another Welsh translation of a Roman, this time Magnus Maximus, the usurping Roman emperor. as described by Bartram, who controlled Britain, Gaul, and for a brief time, Rome. 5. Processing the data. Wow, wasn't that exhausting? 15 people. The last time I had to meet 15 people was when I crashed into a bus. But unlike that moment, what can we actually learn from all of this? Remember that Gwledig literally means country-like today, but this doesn't seem to really translate here. What did these original authors intend? And what are some of the modern theories? 6. Theory. Ver 1. The warlord. Theory. Thanks to this category of extraordinary violence, you might be tempted to think that this was a military title. Emrys fought the Saxons, Cunedda fought everybody, Cadell conquered half of the country, Macsen conquered Rome. And this was the opinion taken by the historian Alistair Moffat, where he suggests that Gwledig would best translate as warlord. This would make sense with these 5 rulers, but it doesn't really track with the remaining 10. None of these other historical figures seem to have a reputation for warmongering, at least not one that survived. And the characters in the stories don't follow this either. Sure, Caswallawn Gwledig is a famous warrior, but the others are just chancellors, court members, or the parents of the characters in the story. Can these be called warlords? Poems praising Welsh leaders for their combat, such as Y Gododin, never use this word either. Furthermore, if Gwledig did just mean warlord, is this how the Welsh should translate it, as a metaphorical word meaning country-like? I don't think so, and other historians don't seem to have agreed with this translation either. Because over the past 200 years, this epithet seems to have stumped most, but that hasn't stopped others from putting forward their theories. 7. The historical theories. 2 distinct schools of thought initially emerged. That Gwledig was some sort of designation of supreme authority, that it was a translation of a Roman title, supreme authority theory. For that first one, we have Pugh in 1803 and McClure in 1877. The first claimed that it was an epithet given to the Llŷr princes as a mark of supreme authority. Llŷr here means English, which is an interesting adjective to apply to 13 individuals from Wales, 1 from Scotland, and a Roman emperor. McClure, meanwhile, just said Gwledig meant supreme. Simple. Another author in 1911 also believed that it just meant ruler. And finally, we have a claim in 1943 that there was a Welsh title similar to the English Bretwalda Roman translation theory. For that second camp, in 1878, one author claimed that Gwledig meant emperor. In 1882, we have Anscombe claiming that it was a translation of ducks. In 1892, it was suggested that it was a translation of Dux Britanniarum, the military leader of Britain. In 1909, the Welsh historian Arthur Wade Evans stated that there can be little doubt that Gwledig is a Welsh rendering of a Roman title. And finally, in 1905, someone claimed that it was a translation of Aurelianus. Remember Emrys Gwledig, the Welsh version of Ambrosius Aurelianus? Yeah, him. Do you remember the other 14 people who aren't called Aurelianus? Apparently, this guy didn't. 8. The problems with these theories. So as you can see, these were the 2 big ideas on what this could mean. Some mark of supremacy, or one that was a translation of something like emperor or dux. The latter is one you can find online occasionally with claims that it meant imperator, and the Wikipedia article on Cadell cites Wade Evans, saying that Gwledig seems to have been applied to some official or claimed position within Roman hierarchy. As you might expect though, I'm about to say that, unfortunately, this has come under some criticism recently. The Latin problem. The historian O.W. Owen McNeill made the excellent point that despite all of these claims of a Roman translation, the Welsh never really did that. Gravestones of early Welsh monarchs bear Latin titles like Protectatus and Rex, and all the way in the 12th century, King Owain of Gwynedd gave himself the Roman title of Princeps. And while yes, eventually there were Welsh words for these, the early rulers don't seem to have translated these Latin titles. In short, if they wanted to claim a position in the Roman hierarchy, they seemed to just use Latin. The emperor problem. The historian Rachel Bromwich also makes the excellent point that Gwledig could hardly translate to something as broad as emperor, because Magnus Maximus is the only Roman emperor to be given this epithet. McNeill disagrees with Wade Evans's certainty and criticizes another historian for his unusual laxity in translating this epithet. Very savage. Oh, and one more thing. He published this 100 years ago. This isn't a new criticism at all, despite the fact that it's still here. The supreme authority problem. The idea that it was some supreme-type title can also be criticized. There's a fundamental flaw with this concept. It's true that it's been applied to several rulers who seem to have had some higher authority, but we also need to look at who it hasn't been applied to. And Bromwich points out two figures who are very notable for having the supreme power, Maelgwn and Vortigern, both of which were never given this epithet. Vortigern was the supposed tyrant of all Britain, and according to a contemporary, the monk Gildas, Maelgwn was one of the most powerful people on the entire island. And according to the historian Wendy Davies, he was likely the most powerful Welsh or Brittonic ruler. Why wouldn't Gwledig, a Welsh epithet, be applied to either of these men if it was supposed to denote supreme authority? Maelgwn was also very violent, so we have yet another warlord that this epithet wasn't given to. Not to mention the famous warlord Arthur, who's also never called Gwledig. Instead, his earliest text gives it to Ambrosius Aurelianus. 9. The mystery deepens further. So as I told you at the start, this has given historians a lot of difficulty. We can theorize translations based on people it has been applied to, but when you look at similar figures who it hasn't, it all falls apart. So after all that, what can we glean from Gwledig? 10. Modern dictionary definitions. We've seen that despite all of this supposed certainty, the idea of Gwledig being a Roman translation hasn't been popular for a century. We've also seen that it doesn't really seem to denote some sort of higher rule or supremacy, since we have two figures who did hold that power who aren't given this epithet. In fact, Cunedda, a leader who a couple of authors claimed as the first ever person to be called Gwledig, wasn't given this title for quite a while either. He's called this in a later genealogy, despite also supposedly holding the supreme power over all of Wales. Meanwhile, the Geiriadur Prefiscal Cymru, the Welsh dictionary, does provide a definition for this word today, despite this uncertainty. But this has issues too. They define it as, and I'm paraphrasing here, a term applied to Brittonic rulers who defended Britain after the Romans left. But that also doesn't really seem to track. Carodicus Gwledig ruled in the 6th century, long after the Romans had left Cunedda. Gwledig doesn't seem to have been doing much defending of Britain either. And Macsen Gwledig was a Roman. It could apply to Emrys Gwledig, who helped the Britons fight the Saxons, but what about everyone else? They do provide a second definition, however, noting that it could possibly apply to leaders of native militia, which is the theory of the historian C.E. Stevens. They suggest that during and soon after the Roman period of Britain, the commanders of the local armies could have been given this nickname, which Bromwich connects to figures like Macsen, Emrys, Cunedda, and Cunedda. This sounds reasonable and makes sense, but once again, looking at who this hasn't been applied to brings up a lot of difficulty. Cunedda wasn't given this epithet until much later, and it's a very exclusive nickname, with plenty of other leaders from this time not being given it, despite the fact that they certainly must have had their own local armies following the Roman withdrawal. And all of this still doesn't explain the translation, country-like. Why such an unusual metaphor? 11. The literary clue. All of this has so far also ignored all of the literary figures that this has been applied to, none of which seem to fit any of these theories. The story of Culhwch ac Olwen has the greatest concentration of Gwledigion in any tale, with 6 out of the 8 fictionalized men with this nickname being found here. And it's quite an interesting aspect because it seems to be implied to be very old. The titular character isn't called Gwledig, but both of his grandfathers are. Several other men aren't called Gwledig, except for one, but several of their fathers are, once again associating this name with the previous generations. None of them seem to fit into Roman titles or being supreme rulers. All it seems to denote here is a vague sense of importance and of the past. So once again, we're stuck. We can't know what these authors intended with this epithet. We don't even know what it means. Sure, we can literally translate it, but that does nothing. What makes someone country-like? And more importantly, what doesn't make someone country-like? Why is this epithet simultaneously quite popular, yet so exclusive? 12. The final theory. Well, the very last theory I'd like to look at, by the historian T.M. Charles Edwards, can provide us a clue as to why this translation is so unusual, although ultimately solving this mystery will prove much more difficult. Charles Edwards points out that Gwlad, the first element in Gwledig, has a related word in Irish, flaith, which according to him can mean both a lordship and a lord, a ruler and the land he rules. He suggests that perhaps in Old Welsh this was true for the word gwlad as well, that it didn't just mean country, but it could also refer to a ruler, a metaphor that seems to have been used at least once by the Old Welsh poet Taliesin. In this case, Gwledig's direct translation becomes a lot more ascertainable. Rather than country-like, it could be ruler-like. And while this can provide a much more sensible direct translation, demonstrating its proper meaning in English, or even figuring it out in the first place, is still out of reach. As has been the case with literally every theory we've seen, anyone can point to traits that connect these rulers, but no one seems to be able to contend with what doesn't make someone ruler-like. Why don't similar rulers also receive this epithet? All we can pick up on really is that this was an epithet, a potential title given to rulers soon after the Roman withdrawal of Britain. And we don't really know why. In stories, it's associated with famous fighters, yet other warriors aren't called this. Major warmongers are nicknamed Gwledig, yet other conquering generals are ignored by it. Powerful men, including an emperor of Rome, are given this title, yet some of the most supreme rulers in Britain are passed over. We can't really hope to understand a metaphor used by writers over 1,500 years ago. But in a way, through the course of this video, you can understand what they were getting at. This strange, exclusive club whose members seem really similar to the people being excluded is so elusive, but it's not completely unknown. You've seen that it was some marker of greatness, somehow. What's really interesting, in my opinion, is that it's also a marker of the past. In Culhwch ac Olwen, it essentially demonstrates a whole theme that would be lost without any of this knowledge of Welsh. Gwledig is a rare name amongst the younger men of the story. It's much more commonly associated with their forefathers. Whatever quality these men possessed, it seems to be almost entirely gone. Whatever made them ruler-like has not been passed down the generations. This story has something to say about the loss of some attribute, but we don't know what this attribute was. Just like the meaning of Gwledig being lost to us today, the quality of what made someone Gwledig was lost to the medieval Welsh too, both in their real rulers who quickly stopped receiving this epithet, and in their stories too. Whatever made someone Gwledig was simultaneously a rare but achievable trait. It was for some warriors, for some conquerors, for some rulers, but not for the figures of the present. Gwledig was a marker of the past, and became such a fixture of the past that we cannot remember what it meant. Culhwch's grandfather possessed this name, and his descendants forgot it. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into linguistic mysteries, make sure to like and subscribe for more content about forgotten history and untranslatable words. What do you think Gwledig meant? Let me know in the comments below.